My grandmother, Lady Constance Ashby, Dowager Duchess of Renwick, was the most formidable woman in 3 counties and possibly the whole of England, and she did not invite people to Renwick Hall. She summoned them. I am Frederick Ashby, second son of the late Duke, brother to the man who now holds the title, and I was present that autumn at Renwick when Grandmother Constance executed what I can only describe as the most elegant act of interference I have ever witnessed. I say elegant because the word connotes both precision and beauty, and hers had both. I say interference because my brother would have said much worse if he had been speaking to any of us. He was not speaking to any of us for a considerable portion of that visit, but I am getting ahead of myself. It was the 2nd week of October. The hills above Renwick Hall had gone amber and copper, and the air carried the particular chill that announces itself not gradually, but all at once, as if autumn had been waiting behind a door and chose that morning to walk through it. I arrived the evening before the others, a privilege of being the younger son, because I had nothing to manage and no estate demanding my immediate return, and grandmother always kept my room in the east wing as though I might appear without warning at any hour. She was usually right. I found her in the library, upright in her chair by the window, a stack of correspondence on her knee, a glass of something amber at her elbow. She was 81. She looked 65 and moved like 50 when she chose to. "Frederick," she said without looking up, "you are punctual, sit down." I sat. "Who else is coming?" "Your brother." She turned a letter over and studied the seal. "And a young woman called Miss Elspeth Carow." I did not know the name immediately. Carow, Colonel Carow's daughter. His eldest, the capable one. Colonel Carow had died the previous spring, leaving behind him a modest estate in Derbyshire, 3 daughters, a mortgage the size of a cathedral, and a reputation that had preceded the mortgage to the grave. The regiment had called it a misunderstanding. The newspapers had called it something else. Whatever it was, it had left the family in the sort of position that society addresses by gradually ceasing to address them at all. "Grandmother," I said carefully, "does Edmund know Miss Carow is coming?" She looked up at me then, and there was something in her expression that I recognized, the calm, pleasant expression she wore when she had already moved 3 pieces across the board and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to notice. "Your brother knows he is expected at Renwick on Friday," she said. "He has been informed that family matters require his attention. And the family matter is that I am 81 years old and I intend to see the succession settled before I am not." She picked up her glass. "He has refused every suitable introduction for 4 years. I have grown tired of subtlety. He will be furious. He is always furious." She took a measured sip. "He will survive." Edmund Ashby, the 8th Duke of Renwick, arrived the following afternoon. He arrived, as he always arrived, slightly ahead of schedule and without any of the social pleasantries a man of lesser consequence might feel obliged to offer. He handed his coat to the footman, nodded at me with something approaching warmth. We were brothers. He was capable of warmth, though he rationed it, and walked directly to the library where grandmother was waiting. I followed at a careful distance. The library door was left open, I noted, which meant either she had not thought to close it or she was unconcerned with witnesses. Knowing my grandmother, it was the second. "You summoned me," Edmund said, "not an accusation. Just the fact of it stated because Edmund dealt in facts." "I asked you to visit," she said pleasantly. "Sit down." "I have ridden 4 hours." "Then you should be grateful for a chair." She waited. He sat the way he always sat, straight, contained, as if allowing himself more than the necessary amount of space was a luxury he had decided long ago to decline. Edmund was 38. He was broad-shouldered and dark and carried the family's particular severity in the line of his jaw. After his wife died, this was 6 years ago now, a fever that took her in a week, the sort of loss that leaves a man not broken but sealed, he had grown quieter. Not unhappily quiet, just sealed. "Who else is coming?" he said. "Miss Elspeth Carow, Colonel Carow's eldest daughter. I have asked her to stay a few days." The silence that followed had a texture to it. "No," Edmund said. "I beg your pardon. I won't be maneuvered." His voice was level. That was the thing about Edmund, he never raised it. He didn't need to. "If that's what this is, I won't stay for it. I'll send my apologies and return next month." "You will stay," grandmother said, in the tone she had been using on Ashby men since before my father was born. "Because I am asking you to, not as a matchmaking exercise." as a courtesy to a young woman who has had a very difficult year and who deserves a few days of civilized company, and whose grandmother I was rather fond of before God saw fit to remove her. You will be civil and pleasant and entirely yourself, and if nothing comes of it, nothing comes of it." She paused. "You may go and change for dinner." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, nodded once, and walked past me in the doorway without a word. I looked at grandmother. She was already reading her correspondence again. "Entirely himself," I said. "That's the instruction." "It is," she said, "because himself is considerably more than he lets on. Miss Carroll, I suspect, will see it. She has that quality." "What quality?" "Of looking at what is actually there." She did not look up. "It is rarer than it ought to be." Miss Elspeth Carroll arrived by hired coach at 4:30, while the light was doing that particular October thing of going gold, and then going gray with very little ceremony between the two. I watched from the upper landing as she came up the front steps. She was younger than I had imagined, no more than 26 or 27, and the word that came to me was composed, in the original meaning of it, the way a careful piece of music is composed, with intention, with each element placed, nothing there by accident. She was not what society calls a beauty, though society's opinion of such things has always struck me as both limited and lazy. She had a straight, clear gaze and the kind of face that becomes interesting the longer you look at it. Her clothes were good but not new. She carried her own small case from the coach rather than wait for the footman, caught herself doing so, and then allowed the footman to take it from her with a small, candid nod that managed to be both grateful and self-possessed. Grandmother met her in the entrance hall. I descended the stairs in time to witness the greeting, which was brief and warm on grandmother's part and careful and warm on Miss Carrow's, the warmth genuine on both sides, the carefulness a form of honesty about her position here. "Lady Constance," she said, "thank you for the invitation. Renwick is very beautiful." "It is," grandmother agreed, "and drafty in October, as you will discover. This is my grandson, Mr. Frederick Ashby." "He is the harmless one." "That is not especially reassuring," Miss Carroll said. I laughed before I could stop myself. She glanced at me with the slightest lift of one corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the intention of it, and that was the moment I understood what my grandmother had seen in her. Edmund appeared at dinner. He was, as promised, civil. He was, as warned, entirely himself, which meant that he asked Miss Carroll 3 precise questions about the Carroll estate's drainage situation. She had apparently written something about it in a letter to a mutual acquaintance of grandmother's, a letter that had been forwarded with the sort of informational efficiency I was beginning to recognize as my grandmother's correspondence strategy, and listened to her answers with the focused attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. Which was, I realized watching him, not common. Edmund's attention was not a social instrument. When he gave it, it meant something. Miss Carroll answered him without false modesty or unnecessary elaboration. She knew what she was talking about. The Carroll drainage problem was apparently severe, the original engineering having been undertaken by someone who understood neither water nor Derbyshire, and she had spent the better part of 2 years addressing it with limited funds and considerable ingenuity. She described it plainly. Edmund asked a follow-up question. She answered that too. Grandmother sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing for 20 minutes, which was the longest I had ever seen her voluntarily silent in my life. After dinner in the drawing room, the atmosphere changed. Grandmother had arranged things, as she arranged everything, with apparent naturalness that concealed a great deal of intention. The room was warm, the fire generous, the candles lit at an angle that was flattering without announcing itself as such. The seating placed Edmund and Miss Carroll across from each other at a comfortable angle, with me to one side and grandmother at the head of the group, in the manner of a conductor who has handed the score to the orchestra and is now simply keeping time. Edmund did not seem to notice the arrangement. Miss Carroll noticed it immediately. I could see it in the slight stillness that came over her as she sat down, not discomfort, exactly, but the recognition of a designed situation. She looked at grandmother for just a moment, something questioning in her expression. Grandmother smiled back with the serene composure of a woman who has never, in 81 years, been caught doing anything she did not mean to do. Miss Carroll picked up her teacup. She was quiet for a moment, gathering herself, and then she simply entered the room, as it were. Not the room with the furniture and the firelight, but the room of the conversation. She set down her cup, looked at Edmund, and said, "Your grandmother tells me you were at Whitmore last spring. I believe you know the Kendrick family." It was not a performance. It was the natural opening gambit of someone who has learned to find her own footing. Edmund blinked, fractionally, but I caught it at being addressed directly with that particular ease, and then he answered her, and the conversation moved forward. The conversation shifted to the county, to the harvest, to a local matter involving a disputed right-of-way that had apparently been generating grievances for 20 years on account of a gate, a ditch, and two families with long memories and short tempers. Edmund knew the full history of it, which did not surprise me. Edmund knew the full history of most county matters, because county matters were the sort of thing that required managing, and he had arranged his knowledge in the same way he arranged everything else, by necessity, systematically, without ornament. Miss Carrow had an opinion about it that differed from his on two specific points, which she stated without preamble, explaining her reasoning in the same plain-spoken way she had explained the drainage situation at dinner. Edmund considered her points with the focused stillness he applied to arguments he took seriously. He did not capitulate. Edmund never capitulated. But he acknowledged the force of the second argument and modified his position by half a degree, which, in Edmund terms, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I watched Miss Carrow register this. She registered it the way a person registers a surprising piece of evidence, with interest, not triumph. She did not smile with satisfaction, or press her advantage, or perform the small social theater of being pleased to have influenced him. She simply noted it and moved on to the next thing. And I saw, watching my brother watch her do that, the first faint crack in his composure, not discomfort, but something more like attention, genuine and involuntary, the way a person looks when they encounter a thing that is not what they expected. It was a good evening, actually. Whatever my grandmother had designed, what happened inside it was real enough. The next morning, I came down early to find Miss Carrow already in the library, standing at the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the hills. She had the look of someone who had slept less than she'd intended and thought more than she'd planned. "Mr. Ashby," she said when she heard me come in. "Miss Carrow," I poured myself a cup from the pot she had evidently already had brought. "You're an early riser." "Habit," she said. "The estate doesn't wait." A pause, though I suppose it'll have to for a few days. I settled into the chair by the fire. "How is it managing? The estate, I mean." She was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, adequately, which is better than it was and not as good as it needs to be." She turned slightly from the window. "Your grandmother is kind to have me here. I mean that genuinely. It's been a rather solitary year." "She is kind," I agreed. "She is also strategic." Miss Carrow looked at me steadily. "Yes, I noticed. And I think she is probably right about a great many things," she said. "And I also think she is treating your brother and me as pieces to be moved, which is not." She stopped herself. "I don't mean to be ungrateful." "You're not being ungrateful, you're being accurate." "I don't know your brother," she said it simply, not as a complaint but as a fact. "He seems formidable, and I imagine he has no more interest in being arranged than I do." She looked back at the hills. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise and spend 4 days performing the role of suitable candidate. It would be dishonest, and I suspect it would fail regardless." I looked at her. I thought of what grandmother had said, of looking at what is actually there. "I think," I said, "that my grandmother's theory is that if you're simply yourselves without the performance, the arrangement becomes unnecessary." "That's a very elegant theory," Miss Carrow said. "She's a very elegant woman." A beat of silence. "What happened to him?" she asked. "Your brother, he seems there's a loss in him. I don't mean to pry." "His wife," I said, 6 years ago." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," not the social form of it, the real thing, briefly said. The morning passed with the easy, slightly tentative quality of two people, finding they can occupy the same space without effort. We talked about the hills and about Derbyshire, and about whether the weather was likely to hold, which are the subjects people discuss when they are in fact discussing whether the other person is someone they can talk to about more than the weather. I decided fairly quickly that Miss Carrow was someone one could talk to about a great many things, and she appeared to arrive at a similar conclusion. because somewhere in the middle of a discussion about the comparative difficulties of estate accounts versus county surveyor filings, we stopped being careful with each other altogether. Edmund appeared at 9:30, nodded at us both, and took a book from the shelf with the air of a man who had also thought more than he'd planned and intended to do something constructive with the morning. He sat at the far end of the library table. He did not read for some time. I know this because I was watching him from behind my newspaper, and he was looking at the window with the steady, enclosed expression of someone working through a calculation that does not involve numbers. Miss Carrow returned to her window and her tea. I pretended to read my newspaper. At some point, Edmund looked up. "Miss Carrow," he said, "I understand you've been managing the Carrow water rights dispute as well as the drainage." "Attempting to," she said. "The county surveyor's office has a standard form for the application. It's been revised in the last 18 months. The revised form has a different submission pathway. They moved it from the land registry clerks to the county liaison directly. Half the applications fail because people use the old route." She set down her tea. "I used the old route." "Then your application has very likely been sitting in the wrong office for 3 months. He paused. "I can write a note to the liaison. It will be redirected within the week." She looked at him for a moment. "That's very kind, thank you." "It isn't kindness," he said. "It's a paperwork error. Correcting it takes 4 minutes." She was quiet for a second. "Then thank you for the 4 minutes." Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptibly, and then it was gone, but I saw it. Grandmother, I noted, had not come down yet. This, I was now certain, was also intentional. Luncheon that day was the 4 of us, and it was comfortable in the way that the previous evening had not quite been. The slight formality of a first meeting dissolved, replaced by the easier friction of people who had been in each other's company long enough to disagree on things without it costing anything. Miss Carrow disagreed with Edmund on the question of open versus enclosed agricultural drainage. He found her argument impractical. She found his theoretical. Neither yielded, and both seemed faintly energized by the exchange in a way that I suspected neither had anticipated. Grandmother watched all of this with the expression of a gardener observing, with quiet satisfaction, a plant that has decided to grow. The afternoon brought walking weather, briefly, in the window between one set of clouds and the next, the kind of October afternoon that apologizes for itself by being very beautiful for exactly the right amount of time. Edmund walked the east pasture, which he did every time he was at Renwick, for reasons no one had ever asked him to explain and which I had always suspected, had something to do with the fact that the east pasture runs to the edge of the hill and gives a long, uninterrupted view of nothing in particular, which Edmund had always found restorative in a way he would never have described aloud. I walked with grandmother as far as the kitchen garden, where she had opinions about the state of the apple espaliers, and expressed them to the gardener with the gentle authority of someone who has been having this same conversation for 40 years, and expects it to continue for 40 more. Miss Carrow walked alone to the ridge above the house. I saw her from the kitchen garden path, a small upright figure against the copper hillside, standing very still for a long time, looking out over the Derbyshire Valley with its October colors, the amber and copper of it, the silver thread of the river far below, the thin line of smoke from some farmhouse chimney rising straight up in the still air. I did not know what she was looking at. Perhaps just the distance. Perhaps just the fact of space and quiet, after a year of managing alone in a house that had contracted around her grief and her responsibility, until the two of them had become nearly the same thing. Edmund came back through the east gate at the same moment she came down from the ridge. They arrived at the garden door within 30 seconds of each other, which I was prepared to attribute to coincidence, until I remembered who had arranged the afternoon and reviewed, briefly, what my grandmother's record on coincidence actually was. I heard later from the footman Jenks, who was constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, that the Duke and Miss Carrow had stood at the garden door for several minutes in conversation before coming inside, and that the Duke had, at some point, held the door for her for rather longer than strictly necessary. Jenks conveyed this information with the dignity he reserved for significant household events. I thanked him gravely. The difficulty, if one could call it that, arrived on the 3rd morning. I found Edmund alone in the study before breakfast, standing at the window with his hands behind his back. This was a posture I associated with Edmund thinking through something that he found genuinely difficult, which was not common. Edmund found most things manageable. He had built his entire life around manageability. "She's leaving today," he said without turning around. "I know. Miss Carrow's hired coach was expected at 2. Grandmother arranged this." "Yes. And you allowed it." "I arrived a day early and ate her shortbread," I said. "I didn't arrange anything." He was quiet for a moment. "She refused to play along," he said. "Miss Carrow, Grandmother designed the whole thing as an introduction, a managed encounter, and Miss Carrow simply didn't perform the expected role. She disagreed with me about drainage. She told me she wasn't going to pretend to be a suitable candidate." He paused. "She said it to you. I heard her, through the library door." I waited. "I am not used to that," he said. "Women who are presented to me are generally, there is a performance, expected on both sides. I find it wearing." A long silence. "She didn't perform it." "No," I said, "she didn't." "She's leaving at 2, he said again. He turned from the window. His expression was the one he wore when he had reached a conclusion that he was not entirely comfortable with, which was the closest Edmund came to uncertainty. "I don't know what to do with that." "You could," I said carefully, "simply talk to her before 2. He looked at me. "Not arranged," I said. "Not grandmother's scheme, just you talking to her." He said nothing. He turned back to the window. I left him there. At 11:30, I was in the entrance hall when I heard them. Not the words, I was not close enough for that, and I was not, whatever Jenks may have believed, constitutionally incapable of minding my own business. I heard the sound of voices, his low and measured, hers clear with that particular quality of stillness she carried. They were in the corridor off the east wing, the long stone passage that connects the library to the morning room, the one that is always cold and always quiet because the household learned long ago to take the other route. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. I went and found grandmother in the conservatory, where she was affecting interest in her orchids. "Edmund is talking to Miss Carrow," I said. She said. "In the east corridor." "That corridor is cold," she said. "I hope he offered her his coat." "You cannot possibly know whether he did." She pruned a small dead stem with decisive care. "He keeps it on the hook by the east library door. He has kept it there since he was 12. If he offered it, he is not entirely beyond help." She set down her shears. "And if he didn't, she is wearing that warm gray shawl she had yesterday, so she will be fine regardless." I looked at her. "You knew about the coat." "I know about most things, Frederick," she said, with the patience of someone explaining something simple to someone they love very much. "That is why I arranged this." "You said it wasn't an arrangement." "It wasn't," she said serenely. "It was an introduction. What they do inside it is entirely their own." At 1:15, 45 minutes before the coach, I passed the morning room and found Miss Carrow inside it, standing with her back to the door, looking at the portrait of my grandfather that has hung above the fireplace since before any of us were born. She was wearing Edmund's coat. She heard me and turned. Her expression was composed and clear and had in it something that had not been there 3 days ago. Not happiness, exactly, or not yet, but the particular quality of a person who has received unexpected information and is quietly, carefully, deciding what to do with it. "Mr. Ashby," she said, "I'm going to miss my coach." "There will be another coach," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked back at the portrait. "He has his grandfather's jaw," she said. "He does," I agreed. "He also has his grandfather's habit of making up his mind about a thing and then acting on it without a great deal of further discussion." "I noticed," she said. A pause. "Will you stay?" I asked. She was quiet for a long time. The clock on the mantel marked the seconds in the patient way clocks do, indifferent to whether the people standing near them are making the most important decisions of their lives or simply waiting for the kettle. "I think," she said finally, "I would like to stay another day." A pause. "I should write to my sister. She'll be managing the house." "There is a writing desk in the library," I said, "and the morning post doesn't go until 4. She nodded once. Then she took Edmund's coat from her shoulders, folded it with the care she gave to everything, and laid it over the chair by the door. She walked out into the corridor. I found Edmund in the study 20 minutes later. He was not at the window this time. He was seated at the desk, writing, with the particular focused energy of a man who has made up his mind. "She's staying," I said. He looked up. "Yes," he said, "I know. Grandmother will be insufferable about this." "Grandmother," he said, returning to his letter, "is always insufferable about things she was right about. It doesn't make her wrong." A pause. "She was right about this." I left him to his writing. What happened over the following months I can tell from the outside only, which is perhaps the right vantage. I am a witness, not a principal, and the things that matter most between two people happen in rooms that other people are not in. What I can say is this. Edmund returned to Renwick in November, and again in January, and the second time he brought with him a parcel of county surveyor's documents and a revised application for the Carrow water rights dispute, which had, as predicted, been sitting in the wrong office for 4 months and was now moving at speed. He delivered these to Elspeth Carrow, she was Elspeth by then, to me at least, and I believed to him, though Edmund's use of a first name is a thing he does privately, and it takes time to surface in the ordinary way of conversation, with the same matter-of-fact economy he'd applied to explaining the paperwork error 3 months before. She received them with the same candid gratitude. Then they walked, the two of them in the Carrow kitchen garden, for nearly 2 hours, and Elspeth's youngest sister, who reported these things to anyone willing to listen, said that the Duke of Renwick smiled 3 times, which she counted because she had been told he did not do it. They were engaged in February. Not announced publicly until March at grandmother's insistence, she had opinions about the timing and the presentation, and her opinions on such matters were, as had been established, generally correct. The announcement was brief and factual and entirely in Edmund's register, which meant it said nothing about what Elspeth Carrow had given the Duke of Renwick and what he had given her, though anyone who looked at them could see it clearly enough. I stood beside grandmother at the reception Renwick Hall held in April. The lilacs had come early that year, and the long drive was lined with them, the scent of them coming through every open window, and watched my brother cross the room to his betrothed with the purposeful directness he gave to things he had decided to do. Elspeth saw him coming. She watched him with the same clear, steady regard she had turned on Renwick Hall's landscape that October morning, when she stood at the kitchen garden path before any of this had happened, the look of someone who sees what is actually there. "You were right," I said to grandmother. "I generally am," she said, without any particular emphasis. She was watching them, and there was something in her expression that was simply love for Edmund, who had been sealed for 6 years and was now, visibly, less so, for the practical, dignified, unbiddable woman who had walked into Renwick Hall on a hired coach and refused to be a piece moved on any board but her own. "Did you know," I asked, "when you wrote to her? Did you know it would be this?" Grandmother was quiet for a moment. "I knew," she said, "that they were the same in the way that matters. Both of them had been managing alone for a long time. Both of them had been told in one way or another that the situation they were in was all that could be expected." She paused. "I am 81 years old. I find that an insufficient answer to give capable people." She turned from the room, then, with the unhurried grace she had carried her whole life, and went to find her chair by the window. I looked at my brother. He was talking with Elspeth with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting, which was, I had decided, the highest thing Edmund was capable of offering and the most constant. She was answering him with the straightforward clarity she gave to everything. Between the two of them there was nothing performed, nothing arranged, nothing that the room required of them except what they chose to offer. My grandmother was right about most things, but she was most right about this, that herself and himself and nothing in the way of it, that was always going to be enough. I think of that October afternoon still. Elspeth at the ridge above the house, standing very still against the copper hillside. Edmund at the east gate, returning from the pasture he always walked. 2 people who had been managing alone, arriving at the same door within 30 seconds of each other, in a house where every arrival had been, one way or another, intended. I don't know if my grandmother arranged that particular moment. I suspect she would say she simply made room for it, and I suspect she would be right. She always was.